Hi, I'm Marty Nemko. I am no licensed financial advisor, but I seem to have a knack for dealing with money. So we're going to talk about making it, spending it, and investing it. In terms of making it, I would encourage you to avoid trying to get rich, because normally when you try to get rich, you're having to do work you really don't care a lot about. Employers pay you a lot, usually to do work that isn't that intrinsically rewarding and is highly, highly competitive. And if you're self-employed, the odds of making big money are very small, and there are very few people who make big money self-employed doing what they love. There are very few musicians or actors or whatever, excuse me a second, who make big money. Normally they're selling a widget, and to make big money selling a widget, you normally are working 60, 80 hours a week. It's usually not worth that. It's a huge price to pay for your quality of life. So aim for using a middle-class paying job, using your best skills that's got a reasonable boss, reasonable commute, ethical work product, not too difficult, not too easy work, and reasonable job stability. And those jobs, unless you have inordinate technical skills, as in, for example, data science, those jobs normally go to people who know somebody. So even if it wasn't the job you were targeting, if you have a friend or a relative who's dropping something in your lap and it meets those requirements, your happiness may not be any less working for some widget entity than working for something cool like sports. Because after a while, even if you're working in sports, the moment-to-moment, day-to-day, unless you're the play-by-play announcer, tends to be much more mundane. It still ends up devolving into being a widget. Now I want to talk about spending it. Many people are too seduced by designer labels, whether it's a designer label neighborhood, a car, clothing, etc. The value derived is normally not worth the enormous additional cost. It's a branding ploy to make more profit. Focus normally on the middle of the road, whether it be, for example, a Whirlpool appliance rather than some super high-end one, whether it be a Toyota rather than a BMW or a Jaguar or Mercedes, because any company that's going to be mass producing a product can afford to hire the very best designers, because the cost of that very best designer or manufacturer is going to be divided across millions of customers. It's true whether it's Red Lobster restaurant or it be, as I said, your Toyota. Or your middle-of-the-road monitor that I'm looking at, or the middle-of-the-road computer. The esoteric ones, if you look at Consumer Reports, generally break down more. And there's nothing prestigious about being broken down on the side of the road with your Jaguar waiting for the tow truck. But housing is I want to pay particular attention to housing and higher ed, which are the two huge costs. The actual safety value or networking value or whatever of a Tony neighborhood, a status neighborhood, is just not worth the enormous difference in cost. An average house in America probably costs about $350,000, but in a status neighborhood it could well be over $1 million or over $2 million. That changes your entire life, having to pay that kind of mortgage. Not just the stress, but you do have to do a job that you probably don't like very much in order to afford that. And yet your quality of life, your actual danger of living in a more modest neighborhood is trivial. I mean, I'm not going to say you prance around in seductive clothing at 2 a.m. and you're in a marginal neighborhood. But the difference in cost is so enormous that it's really worth making that one-time decision to live in a modest neighborhood. And then if, let's say, the schools are bad in the neighborhood, make the one-time effort to get an intra-district transfer so you don't have to pay the big money for private schools. Very often you can get your kid into a school other than the local public school, and therefore saving you an enormous amount of money without shortchanging your child. Same is true of colleges, of course, as well. The actual value added in terms of learning, even connections, at a private college versus a state university is generally very small. And if you know how to make the most of that state university, if you do join extracurriculars, if you do network well, if you do get to know professors and professors to know you well, you can often make as many connections at the state U than a fancy private U. Now, I'm not saying that you should turn down Harvard or Stanford. Those connections are invaluable, and that designer label opens too many doors to turn that down. And besides, they have a lot of money, so they tend to give generous financial aid. But if your choice is a private college that's second or third tier, in my judgment, that's not worth the enormous cost difference that even after financial aid exists, especially because so much financial aid is in form of a loan, which has to be paid back plus interest and cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. I think that's all I want to say about spending. Now I just want to say a little bit about investing. It's well known, and it's certainly true, that if at all possible, after a few months, kind of a nest egg that you keep in a fairly liquid, like in a checking account or a low interest bearing money market account, you should first fund your retirement plan because it's tax deferred. That's a 401k or a 403b, or there's something called a 457, which you can use after you funded your 401k. IRAs, SEP IRAs, those are great because your earnings, instead of being taxed right away, continues to get reinvested, and see, that's the miracle of compounding, and that's worth doing. But the main thing I want to talk about is the following, and again, I am not a licensed financial advisor, but this is my thinking for what it's worth. I'm going to talk about just one investment. It is Vanguard Growth Index Fund. That basically invests in, if you buy a share of that, you are getting to invest in all of the Fortune 500 companies, so you're getting diversification. And it's not weighted equally. It's weighted according to which ones have done the best recently or the best year. I am aware that over time, in the past, stocks that did well this year are less likely to do well next year, and so what are called growth stocks and value stocks perform equally. But there's so much more information available today that is incorporated into the price of a stock on a given day that I believe I don't want to bet against the money. I want to follow the money. And so by definition, the stocks that have been growing in that Fortune 500, that means that more of the money has been bet on that stock doing well. I want to bet on that. So it's weighted that way. It's all the Index 500, but weighted according to the ones that have done the best recently. I don't remember if it's best 6 months or the last year or whatever. There are other advantages to this too. Of course, Vanguard is by far the lowest cost way to diversify. The fee for investing in Vanguard Index Growth Fund is about 1/10%, and if you have enough money in there, I think it's $50,000. It's down to half of that. And there are other advantages because the stocks that comprise the stocks in that mutual fund, Vanguard Growth Index Fund, don't turn over very much. It's not like there is a fund manager who's buying, selling. Most of them stay put. Therefore, each year when you get your tax return, you are not going to have as much capital gains on which you'd have to pay tax. That, again, allows your earnings to keep compounding. So someone could say, the American economy is very fragile. And it is. I am not optimistic about America's future or America's economy. But in my judgment, rather than, as is widely recommended, have a good blend of stocks and bonds that represent your risk tolerance. And that's perfectly appropriate, in which case one of the Vanguard all-in-one funds, you can Google that, is terrific. It balances your stocks and bonds depending upon your risk tolerance. But my own personal philosophy is that I am willing to bet on the best and brightest people in the world. As a career counselor, I know that disproportionately, the best, brightest, and most motivated people tend to work for the major designer label companies, for the Googles, for the Facebooks, for the even Exxons of the world, the Apples, the Citigroups. Those are the companies that are in the Standard & Poor's 500. So whatever the future brings, in my judgment, I would rather bet my dollars that they will have a better sense of what to do with the money and how to invest it or hold off on investing it than I otherwise would. I am well aware that there have been stock market tanks, notably the 1929 stock market crash, where basically the experts were saying what I was saying. Oh, companies will do fine, capitalism will be fine. Indeed, capitalism is very vulnerable right now. And I do think the future is vulnerable. And I frankly, in terms of the stock market, I think we're going to have an Elizabeth Warren-type president. And she is going to really stick it to the corporations, which could really affect stock prices. That said, I am still willing to say, rather than be super conservative, which I could do, and an argument could be made for simply putting all your money in insured CDs that now if you buy a 2-year CD, you can be guaranteed 2 or 3%, 2.5%. A 5-year CD, you can be guaranteed 3%. That's certainly an argument can be made for that. But I tend to want to, as I said, invest in what I believe are some of the world's best and brightest, like the leading biotech companies, the Amgens, the Genentechs, which are all part of the S&P 500. And again, the S&P 500 are the largest companies. They have the most money. They can afford to buy the best talent. They can afford to invest the most in research and development. They have the deepest pockets. They can survive downturns. And even in the stock market crash of 1929, if you held on long enough, you would have made a fortune. Of course, not everybody has that kind of a long time horizon. But anyway, those are my thoughts about investing. As always, I like to end these by saying, you feel free to put a thumbs up or thumbs down at the bottom of this, or you can write a comment, or you could share it on social media. I apologize, my voice was kind of funny. I'm not going to re-record it because hopefully that voice was not too annoying. In any event, I hope to do better next time. But thank you for watching. I'm Marty Nemko.